In this video, we're going to show you how to get started with Python. We're using Python 3, and on Blackboard, the pre-lecture preparation includes links to instructions for installing Python on your own machine. So make sure to do that if you haven't already. Once you install Python, you'll see that one of the options that you're given is a program called idle. And that's what we're going to be using when we interact with Python. When you open up idle, which I've already done, you start out in what's called the shell. And you can see these three greater than symbols. That is the shell prompt, and it's indicating that Python is waiting for us to type something in. One thing you can do is enter something that involves arithmetic. So for example, you can make use of these operators that are listed here. Most of them are pretty straightforward. It's worth noting that multiplication is done using an asterisk. So 6 times 7 gives me 42. And you can see I can just put that expression and hit enter, and it shows me the result. 2 asterisks give me exponentiation. So here I can compute 2 to the 4th, or 16. And then the other one that you may not have seen before is the modulus or mod operator. We use the percent sign for that, and it gives us the remainder of a division. So for example, 17 mod 2, 2 goes into 17 8 times with a remainder of 1. So we get a 1 there. If I do 17 mod 3, 3 goes into 17 5 times with a remainder of 2. Now, it's important to realize that the operators follow the standard order of operations, the ones you may have seen from high school algebra. For example, multiplication gets done before addition. So if I type in 2 plus 3 times 5, the multiplication is going to get done first, and I end up with 17. If you need to change the order of operations, you can use parentheses. So if I put parentheses around the addition, it will get done first, and I'll get 25. Now, it turns out that there are different what are called data types in Python, and this is true in all languages because different kinds of values are stored differently in the computer's memory, and they're also operated on differently. In Python, there are two main types for numbers. There's an integer type, and there's a separate type for numbers that include a decimal, and those are called floating point numbers or floats. Now, it turns out that each data type has its own set of operators. So there are really two sets of numeric operators, one for integers, or ints, and one for floating point numbers, or floats. And the way that Python determines which one to use, which operator to use, is based on these rules. If at least one of the operands is a float, the result will be a float, because we're using the float operator. But if both of the operands are ints, the result will be an int, because we're using the int version of the operator. So for example, if I do 3 plus 7.0, because the 7.0 is a float, it has a decimal, I'm going to use the float addition operator, and I get a float result. But if I use 2 ints, I get an int result. Now that's typically how things work, but there's one really important exception, and that is division. It turns out that if I use the single slash division operator, I'm always going to get a float, regardless of the types of the numbers that I'm dividing. So for example, if I do 5/3, I get this as the result. And that's a good thing because I need a float here to fully capture the result. But notice what happens if I do 6 divided by 3. Ordinarily we would think of that as being an integer result, but I get 2.0. So you always get a float if you use the single slash division operator. Now there is a separate double slash operator for what is called integer division. And here I'm always going to get an int as the result. So now if I do 6/3, I get 2 with no decimal. So here I'm using integer division, no decimal in the result. And this will happen even if we would ordinarily get a fractional part in regular mathematics. So for example, 11/5 gives me 2, not 2.2. So I'm discarding whatever comes after the decimal. 5//3 is going to give me 1. So again, we're throwing away what comes after the decimal. And it's important to realize here that it does not round, right? If it did, 5//3, which is 1.66666, would give me 2. But I'm not getting 2, I'm getting 1, because we're not rounding, we're truncating. And then there's one more type I want to briefly mention. It's the string type. A string in computer science is a sequence of characters or other kinds of symbols. It's used for text in your program. And when we put a string into our code, we need to surround it by either double quotes or single quotes. And I've given you an example of each variation here. It doesn't matter whether you use the double quotes or the single quotes.